I'm sorry about that. I think we lost you guys for a bit. We had some sound issues, but hopefully we're back on. We're going to have to restart. So, inshallah, just bear with us. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما يا كريم. Inshallah, before starting the second juz, there are a couple of points that we wanted to cover, and then inshallah we'll continue with the second juz. The first is many people, they were wondering what the purpose was behind these sessions that we're doing. And the reason behind this is for us to, inshallah, as we're reciting the Quran during this month and even outside of this month, have a general idea and have a general context of what the verses of the Quran are about. And then after that, beyond that, inshallah, once we go and study these verses, it's a lot easier for us. Don't think that you, by attending this one session, is enough for you in your study of the Quran. This is just an intro. This is just a brief summary of the themes of the Quran, so that when you recite the verses or when you hear the verses, you understand the perspective of where the verses are coming from. What is the intended purpose behind the verses of Allah Azza wa Jal? The other question as well was, what is the difference between the Mekki verses, the Madani surahs or verses? We had said that Surah Al-Fatiha is a Mekki surah, and we said that Surah Al-Baqarah is a Madani surah. And even though there are different ways of defining what a Mekki surah is versus what a Madani surah is, what is most accepted is that a Mekki surah or a Mekki verse is that which was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ before his migration to Medina. And so you're going to see that there is a strong focus in there, in the Mekki surahs, on theology, on our belief. Because in Mecca, they are focusing mostly on their belief, whereas in Medina, the Madani verses, those verses after the migration of the Prophet ﷺ, they also deal with legal matters. They also deal with laws. And so in Surah Al-Baqarah, we're going to see that there are various laws mentioned. And that is because now the Muslims, they have the ability to actually enforce laws. They actually have the ability to implement the laws of Allah Azza wa Jal in their life. Whereas in Mecca, as they're being persecuted, Allah Azza wa Jal is strengthening them by strengthening their faith, by strengthening their belief in Allah and in the matters of the unseen. And in the Madani verses, now that the Muslims are established in a place, it is how to have a perfect society. What are the laws that a perfect society needs? Ones that if they were to implement, they would have the perfect society. The other question was regarding Bani Israel. What are the Bani Israel? We said that about a third of this surah, or quite a lot of this surah Al-Baqarah, deals with Bani Israel. And what we mean by Bani Israel is the children of Israel. Ibrahim alayhi salam, he had two sons that we had mentioned, Ismail and Ishaq alayhim salam. And Ishaq alayhi salam, he had another son named Yaqub. And another name for Yaqub alayhi salam is Israel. So Bani Israel just means that those who follow in the progeny, or those who are descendants of Yaqub alayhi salam, Bani meaning the children of Israel, the children of Yaqub. And so from the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ishaq alayhi salam, and then Ismail alayhi salam, we see that the lineage of the prophets remains within Yaqub alayhi salam. That's why all the prophets are actually from Bani Israel. Whereas the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, when he is sent, he is not from Bani Israel. He is actually from the other side of the family, which is Ismail alayhi salam's progeny. So that is what we mean by Bani Israel. And the reason why they are mentioned so much in this surah is because in Surah Al-Fatiha, let's summarize the first juz within a minute, inshallah, so that we can continue with today's. In Surah Al-Fatiha, we were asking for guidance to the straight path. We were asking Allah Azza wa Jal, after praising Him and after mentioning all the praise that is due to Him, we ask Allah Azza wa Jal for the straight path. And then we mention that this is the path of those that you have blessed. not the path of those upon whom your anger is, and neither the path of those who have been misguided. And so Allah Azza wa Jal, primarily in Surah Al-Baqarah, is dealing with the first category of people. The people upon whom the anger of Allah Azza wa Jal is, not because of who they are, but because of their actions. They have ilm, they have knowledge, but they don't act on it. And so they have ilm bila amal. They have knowledge without actually acting upon that knowledge. Whereas the second group of people, even though they're mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah in a very brief manner, the ones who have been misguided, their mention will actually be in the following surah, in Surah Al-Imran. And so in Surah Al-Baqarah, we see how Allah Azza wa Jal put so much emphasis on submitting ourselves to Allah Azza wa Jal. We see this in the story of Adam alayhi salam. We see this in the story of the calf, and we see this in the various other stories as well within Surah Al-Baqarah. And we also said that there is a constant reminder from Allah Azza wa Jal to Bani Israel. Remember all the favors of Allah Azza wa Jal upon you, that Allah Azza wa Jal blessed you with, hoping that when they remember these virtues or these favors that were given to them by Allah Azza wa Jal, that they would turn back to Allah Azza wa Jal. And we had mentioned that Surah Al-Baqarah, this part of it, the majority of it, was revealed in the first 2 years of the Prophet ﷺ being in Medina. So there's a lot of emphasis placed on them because that group of people, Bani Israel, are within Medina, waiting the Prophet who is supposed to come. They know the Prophet ﷺ, and inshallah we're going to take this today as well. And he is from the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam. When he was building the Kaaba, he had made dua to Allah Azza wa Jal for there to come forth a messenger and a prophet. And this one that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was talking about was actually the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And so after all these constant reminders to them, and after all these chances that are given to them, they continue to refuse to submit to Islam. And once again, Islam actually means submission. A Muslim is the one who submits. Muslim linguistically means the one who submits. And so when they refuse to do so, till now, the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims, when they would pray, their qibla would be to Jerusalem. Their qibla would be towards Baytul Maqdis. But now, after all of these instances of them not turning to Allah Azza wa Jal, and Jerusalem is a place that they held in high regard as well, because many of their prophets were from there. Allah Azza wa Jal now changes the qibla. And in changing the qibla, there is a great message in that you people are no longer the favored people. You were the favored people of Allah, and Allah bless you with many favors, but when time and time again you refuse to submit and you are rebellious, then Allah Azza wa Jal will leave you, and then Allah Azza wa Jal brings forward the mention of us Muslims. And so this qibla, even this qibla, this new qibla that we will now turn to, the Prophet ﷺ, when he was in Mecca, the salah, the prayer was actually prescribed in Mecca. When he would pray towards Jerusalem, he would face the north, because Jerusalem from Mecca is to the north. But he would make sure that he was to the south of the Qibla, so that the Kaaba is between him and Jerusalem. And in this way, he would be facing both the Kaaba as well as Jerusalem. Now, when the Prophet ﷺ migrates to Medina, that's no longer possible, because Medina is actually north of Mecca. So if this is Mecca, this is Medina, this is Jerusalem. You can either face north towards Jerusalem, or you're going to face south. You can't face both at the same time. And so the Prophet ﷺ, for a few months, he is facing north towards Jerusalem, and he looks up to the sky, waiting for revelation to come from Allah Azza wa Jal with the command to change the qibla towards Mecca. So this qibla is something that was built by Ibrahim alayhi salam, someone they revere. And this is actually within their books, that when the Prophet comes, he will change the qibla to Mecca. But when that happens, they refuse to submit. And that is why Allah Azza wa Jal, he starts this juz off by saying, سَيَقُولُ السُّفَهَاءُ مِنَ النَّاسِ مَا وَلَّهُمْ عَنْ قِبْلَتِهِمُ الَّتِي كَانُوا عَلَيْهَا. Those who are foolish, the foolish, they will say, what caused the people, what caused the Muslims, what caused the Prophet ﷺ to turn away from the original Qibla, which is Jerusalem. What caused them to turn away from Jerusalem and face the Kaaba instead? And over here, Allah Azza wa Jal, when He addresses them as sufaha, as foolish people, the reason He does so is because anyone who refuses to submit to Allah Azza wa Jal based on their own reasoning, because they think that they don't understand the reasoning, they're a foolish people. Because Allah Azza wa Jal, He is the one who is the all-wise. He is the one who is the all-knowledgeable. So when He legislates for a reason. When He legislates, He actually legislates for great wisdom. And so just because you, with your limited intellect, cannot understand that, and you refuse to submit because of that, that shows that you are a foolish person. Someone who fails to submit to the one who is the all-wise, the all-knowledgeable. And so now that the Qibla has been changed and the message has been relayed to them, we gave you chances even within Medina after the Prophet ﷺ came, and so many chances were given to you. You were reminded of all the favors of Allah Azza wa Jal upon you, and you still refused to submit. Now the Muslims, these people are the new people who are the favored people. And it's no longer Jerusalem that they face, it's the Qibla, it's the Kaaba. And that is why Allah Azza wa Jal in the following verse, in that same verse, He says that the reason behind that was not for any particular reason that we would have to understand. The main purpose, as Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, is إِلَّا لِنَعْلَمَ مَنْ يَتَّبِعُ الرَّسُولَ مِمَّنْ يَنْقَلِبُ عَلَىٰ عَقِبَيْهِ. The reason for Allah Azza wa Jal to change the Qibla is to know those who will submit to the command that the Prophet ﷺ relays to them. And you can also know the difference between those group of people who submit to this and those who refuse to do so. Those who turn away from the Prophet ﷺ, and doing so, they also turn away from Allah Azza wa Jal. And so now Allah Azza wa Jal will begin praising us. He will begin praising us as a people. كُنْتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ. You, O Muslims, you are the best of nations. You are the best of nations ever. And what is the reason behind that? Because you enjoin the good and you forbid the evil. So Allah Azza wa Jal, He over here calls us the best of nations and also the most balanced of nations. Wasata over here can mean both things. It means the balanced, the central, the one that's away from both extremes, the moderate path. And it also means the best in the Arabic language. And we are both. We're not on any extreme, and at the same time, we're also the best of nations sent to all of mankind. And then Allah Azza wa Jal, He makes it very clear that even this change of the Qibla was once again to see, will you submit? We said Surah Al-Baqarah is all about submitting. It's all about lessons we learn from the lives of Ibrahim alayhi salam, Ismail alayhi salam, and other prophets who they hold in high regard, like Yaqub alayhi salam, and Ishaq alayhi salam, and the other ones, Musa alayhi salam. And the lesson constantly is about submitting to Allah Azza wa Jal. Once again, it's about submitting. Are you going to listen to Allah when He asks you to change the direction? For some people, this is something very hard. All these years we've been facing one way, and now we're going to face another way when we pray to Allah. And this was something that even some Muslims had a tough time with at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And especially for those who had lost loved ones who passed away before the change of the Qibla. They said to the Prophet ﷺ, what about those people who have passed away? They were praying facing Jerusalem. They weren't praying facing Mecca. What's going to happen to their prayer? And Allah Azza wa Jal, He says their reward is there, because Allah Azza wa Jal at that time had told them to face a certain direction, and they did so. At that time, submission was to face Jerusalem, and they did so. And so Allah Azza wa Jal, He says He will not allow for their acts of worship, their salah, to be gone to waste. And over here, Allah Azza wa Jal, He actually links the prayer to Iman. He actually uses the word Iman to talk about the salah, to talk about the prayer. And this shows us that those who have Iman, they actually pray to Allah Azza wa Jal as well. And Iman is linked with our actions. It's not just something that we believe is in our hearts. It is also the actions that one does. Then Allah Azza wa Jal, He also makes it very clear that it doesn't matter what direction you face in the grand scheme of things. Of course, Allah Azza wa Jal wants to see who is going to submit. But it doesn't matter whether you face east or west, any way that you face, it actually belongs to Allah Azza wa Jal. This world has been created by Allah Azza wa Jal. The directions that we know of have been created by Allah Azza wa Jal. But what He wants to see from us is a submission to Allah Azza wa Jal. Now, Allah Azza wa Jal then talks about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and He also talks about those who were given the books before the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from the Jews and the Christians. And Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, الَّذِينَ آتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابَ يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. Those who were given the books, those whom Allah Azza wa Jal gave the books to, they know the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam the same way that they know their own children. In fact, Abdullah ibn Salam radiallahu anh, he was from one of the most learned of Jewish scholars in Medina when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam went to Medina. And he says, as soon as he saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he matched the description in their books. Right away, he knew that this is a prophet that our books talk about. And so, in fact, he went to the extent of saying he knows the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he is a prophet, more so than the fact that he knows his kids are his own kids. But what is the thing that stops them from submitting to that? It is not that they don't know the truth. It is that he is not from amongst them. He is not from Bani Israel. And that is where we see once again their problem with submitting to the will of Allah Azza wa Jal. Then Allah Azza wa Jal, He continues and talks about, in general, in this life, we're going to be tested in different ways. Allah Azza wa Jal, out of some of the ways that He says, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. That Allah Azza wa Jal, He will test us with fear, with hunger, with poverty, with loss of life. We're going to lose loved ones. But Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, give glad tidings to those who are patient. Who are these people? الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ. Those, when calamity strikes them, they say, إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Verily to Allah we belong, and to Allah we shall return. We realize the reality of this world, that we belong to Allah. This is just a test. This life is just a test. And what is asked from us over here is just obedience of Allah Azza wa Jal, is just to submit to Allah. But everything belongs to Allah, and everything shall return to Him. And the main thing for us to focus on are the deeds that we perform in this world. Because if we return to Allah Azza wa Jal with a set of good deeds, then we shall be pleased with what Allah Azza wa Jal rewards us with in the hereafter. Then Allah Azza wa Jal, He continues and talks about Safa and Marwa, the two mountains or the two hills in Mecca. He says, إِنَّ الصَّفَا وَالْمَرْوَةَ مِنْ شَعَائِرِ اللَّهِ. That verily Safa and Marwa are from the sha'air of Allah Azza wa Jal. They're from the signs of Allah Azza wa Jal. And the reason for that is, the reason for mentioning this here is because the non-Muslims, the Quraysh of Mecca, they had actually put two statues on either of these two mountains. And this was a practice that the Quraysh had incorporated within their pilgrimage. They had some remnants of the teachings of Ibrahim alayhi salam. But for the most part, they had lost those teachings. And so from those teachings was going between Safa and Marwa, as well as doing tawaf around the Kaaba. But now that they had placed these idols, and they would touch the idol each time they would go on either side, we're good. Each time they would go on either side, the Muslims, the believers, they almost felt that there's something wrong in doing the same, because they saw the idols there. They saw that the idols that were there on top of these hills invalidated Safa and Marwa. They took something away from Safa and Marwa. But Allah Azza wa Jal here is saying it doesn't matter what people do. It belongs to Allah. It is a sign of Allah Azza wa Jal. It is a sign from Allah Azza wa Jal. It is a sign that points, or it is something that holds significance in Islam. Inna Safa wal Marwata min sha'airillah. So therefore, we must still do it. Once again, a call to submission. It doesn't matter what the opposing party does. What Allah wants you to do, you do regardless of whatever you feel internally. And then Allah Azza wa Jal, He goes on to mention the different signs in general. إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Verily, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the changing day and night, as well as a ship that floats in the water, and all these other different signs, Allah Azza wa Jal, He's mentioning the different signs. He says, these are signs for whom? For people, لِقَوْمٍ يَعْقِلُونَ, for people of intellect, for people who are going to think and ponder over these signs. Many of us, we see signs in our everyday life, but that doesn't bring us closer to Allah. And over here, Allah Azza wa Jal is making that very clear, that the signs of Allah are very clear, but it's just for us to take them. And so just because we are unwilling to accept the signs of Allah Azza wa Jal, that doesn't diminish from these signs. Then Allah Azza wa Jal continues, and then He talks about the importance of following the commandments of Allah Azza wa Jal. Allah says, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمُ اتَّبِعُوا مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ قَالُوا بَلْ نَتَّبِعُ مَا أَلْفَيْنَا عَلَيْهِ آبَاءَنَا. When it is said to them to submit, when it is said to them to follow that which Allah Azza wa Jal has revealed to them, they say, we are okay with that which we found our forefathers upon. We don't really care much about these new teachings that are coming our way. We are happy with the way of our forefathers, and we're going to stick to that. Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, أَوَلَوْ كَانَ آبَاؤُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ شَيْئًا وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ. Allah Azza wa Jal, He's making it very clear. You're following your forefathers, even if they were those who were of poor intellect when it comes to religion, or they were misguided. Just because they were your forefathers, you're going to follow them even if they're misguided? If you follow them, that means you too will be misguided if their teachings were that of misguidance. And then Allah Azza wa Jal, He mentions to us what real birr is. He mentions that the true piety is not to face one direction or the other. The real piety is to have iman in Allah, in the messengers, in the angels, in the other matters of the unseen. And once again, Surah Al-Baqarah is filled with commandments related to Islam, as well as different things related to iman. It is a call for us to take upon the pillars of Islam, as well as the pillars of iman. Then Allah Azza wa Jal, He continues, and then in this part, and it's very relevant for us today as we are fasting, Allah Azza wa Jal, He mentions the obligation of the fast. Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. That fasting has been prescribed to you as it was prescribed to those before you. And the purpose for us to be fasting, the purpose that Allah Azza wa Jal prescribed this for us, is so that we would have taqwa. And so, subhanallah, Allah Azza wa Jal, He begins this chapter, Surah Al-Baqarah, by saying, Hudan lil muttaqeen, that this book that Allah has sent is a guidance for those who have taqwa. Then Allah Azza wa Jal, within this surah and within the rest of the chapters of the Quran, He gives us ways for us to gain that taqwa, to gain that link with Allah Azza wa Jal, so that we can then benefit from this message that has been sent down from Allah Azza wa Jal. This is the only place in the whole Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah Azza wa Jal talks in detail about the fast. And so, insha'Allah, one must try to ponder over these verses on their own. Allah Azza wa Jal, He describes these days, the days of Ramadan, as ayyam ma'dudat, as very limited days. And the reason for that is we do face hardship during these days. We get hungry, we get thirsty, we're forced to stay away from other things that normally we could do. But Allah Azza wa Jal, He reminds us, these are just a limited number of days, so be patient. And at the same time, it's also a reminder for us that since these days are so limited, turn back to Allah Azza wa Jal. Do as much as you can in these days, because these days are very limited. So in both sense, be patient with any hardship that you endure during this month, and also because these days are so limited, grasp the opportunity. Don't let it go. Do as much as you can within these days. And then Allah Azza wa Jal, He also mentions the concessions given to us within this pillar of Islam, that of fasting, those who are sick, those who are unable to fast, those who are traveling, and the other things that we had covered previously in our talk about Ramadan. But the whole point here is Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. Allah Azza wa Jal, He intends for you ease. He does not intend for you hardship. And so that's for us to realize that Islam, it is ease. When we follow Islam, that is a path that makes our life on this earth easy. It's not something that makes our life on this world hard. We might face some hardships, but the long-term consequences, whether it's in this world or in the hereafter, is that enduring those minor hardships will give us greater ease. And that is why Islam is to be followed. And we shouldn't say, in this, Islam is hard. In this, it's too tough for me to follow, therefore I won't follow it. Following Islam is ease. You find ease when you follow Islam. Don't think that ease over here means when you find something tough in Islam, you can leave that for something easy. Because that which has been prescribed to you, that is what is easy. Then Allah Azza wa Jal, He continues, and then He says, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ. When he tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when my servants ask you about me, then Allah Azza wa Jal, He answers it Himself, فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ. I am very close. أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ. I answer the call of the one who calls upon me when he calls to me. فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْشُدُونَ. Then Allah Azza wa Jal, He also gives us a bit of advice here. Answer the call of Allah Azza wa Jal. Once again, submission. فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي. And let them have faith in me, have belief in me. لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْشُدُونَ. So that they may be of those who are guided. Then Allah Azza wa Jal, within the next few verses, He talks about Hajj and some of the acts related to Hajj. And over here, the focus will be primarily on the physical actions of ours during Hajj. And in Surah Al-Hajj, He will actually talk about the spiritual matters related to Hajj. And then Allah Azza wa Jal, He, after going into great detail about the Hajj or in mentioning how Hajj came about, even that was something that Ibrahim alayhi salam announced to the world. Allah Azza wa Jal commanded Ibrahim alayhi salam to make the call for Hajj. And then Allah Azza wa Jal, He allowed for His voice to be spread all over earth so that it would be known that this pilgrimage is something that must be done. After that, Allah Azza wa Jal, He talks about the different groups of people. He talks about those who ask Allah Azza wa Jal. They say, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا وَمَا لَهُ فِي الْآخِرَةِ مِنْ خَلَاقٍ. They just ask for goodness in this world. They forget about the hereafter. They don't think about the hereafter. They're just giving precedence to this life that they live in. And then Allah Azza wa Jal, He continues and says, وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَقُولُ رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. And from people who make dua to Allah Azza wa Jal, are those who ask Allah Azza wa Jal for the best in this world. They ask for hasana in this world, and they also ask for the best in the hereafter, and they also ask from protection from the punishment of the fire. Allah Azza wa Jal over here, He says, أُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمْ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا كَسَبُوا وَاللَّهُ سَرِيعُ الْحِسَابِ. Allah Azza wa Jal over here, He then mentions, after all these verses of Hajj and about making dua, He says that they will have that which they earned. And Allah Azza wa Jal is very quick in giving the reward. After this, Allah Azza wa Jal, He gives many different laws. He talks about many different laws related to the family. Talks about marriage, talks about divorce, talks about the spending that one must do on one's family, on one's wife. And then after mentioning all these different things, Allah Azza wa Jal then connects that back to the taqwa of Allah Azza wa Jal. Because these are things that normally many people are unjust in. In these situations of divorce, in terms of spending, they can be unjust. They can be unreasonable. And so over here, there is a call from Allah Azza wa Jal. Be just. Have taqwa of Allah. And taqwa of Allah, as we had mentioned, is to create a barrier between yourself and the punishment of Allah Azza wa Jal. And the way to do so is by doing that which Allah Azza wa Jal tells us to do, and staying away from that which Allah Azza wa Jal tells us to stay away from. After that, Allah Azza wa Jal also tells us about many other laws related to intoxicants and gambling. And then He mentions over here that even though there might be some good in it, the evil that exists within these things is greater Therefore, this is something that Allah Azza wa Jal has made impermissible for us. And we will find this in many other things that we want to do in this life. We think that there is goodness in it. But in reality, Allah Azza wa Jal knows that the harm that's within these things is greater. We may not realize at this time, but Allah, the All-Wise, the All-Knowing, knows. Therefore, He has made it impermissible. Then Allah Azza wa Jal, He mentions something very important. He's mentioning all these laws, and then He wants us to submit fully. He says, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu, O you who believe, udkhulu fi silmi kaffa. Enter into the fold of Islam entirely. Submit yourself entirely. Don't be in between. Don't be half here and half there, where you're submitting in some things and you're refusing to submit in others. Submit yourself fully to Allah Azza wa Jal. وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ. When you don't fully submit, then you start to follow in the steps of shaitan. And Allah over here, He says, do not follow in the footsteps of shaitan. إِنَّهُ لَكُمْ عَدُوٌّ مُبِينٌ. Verily, he is a clear and evident enemy for you. Then Allah Azza wa Jal, after mentioning a few of the different things, He mentions another thing that we can find great comfort in. He says that وَعَسَى أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. It may be that you dislike something, but it is good for you. And Allah says, and it may be that you like something, and it is bad for you. And then Allah Azza wa Jal says, وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Allah knows and you do not know. So many a times things happen in our lives. We consider them to be something negative, but in reality they're a great positive for us. And there are other negative things that we've been told to stay away from. And we think that there is some goodness in there. But Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, you might think that it is good, but there is actually great evil within that. It is actually bad for you. And in the end, it is Allah who knows with His infinite knowledge, and not you with your limited knowledge. Then Allah Azza wa Jal, after this, He starts talking about the story of Jalut and Talut. Once again, going back to Bani Israel, going back to the children of Israel. And He mentions that the people, they ask for a king. They ask their prophet for a king who will help them fight the enemy. And so it is asked, what will happen when this king comes? And then the commandment comes for you to fight the enemy. Will you then turn away? And they say, of course not. What will prevent us then from fighting in the way of Allah Azza wa Jal? Having realized that we were kicked out from our homes, us and our children, and all the losses that they faced. But then when Allah Azza wa Jal prescribed that for them, many of them, they turned away from this judgment of Allah Azza wa Jal. And so there is a great lesson within this, that we shouldn't wait for things to come about. Whatever situation we're in right now, we grab onto that and we try to perform in that. We don't say, when that happens, I'm going to do this. When this happens, then I'm going to turn to Allah Azza wa Jal. Because as we see in this story, many people, they said that. And when the law of Allah, when the command of Allah came, even though they were waiting for that command, they refused to submit to Allah Azza wa Jal. So don't ever say, oh, I'm just waiting for this to happen or that to happen to submit. If you're not submitting right now, you're more than likely not to submit when the things that you were waiting for take place as well. So what you have to do is get rid of all excuses. Look for excuses to obey Allah Azza wa Jal. Look for excuses to do goodness. Don't look for excuses to stay away from the goodness and the obedience of Allah Azza wa Jal. Within this, we also find many lessons in the story of Jalut and Talut, in what is in the West known as the story of David and Goliath. It is not the size that matters of the people. Dawood alayhi salam, he wasn't the strongest of people. And yet he was able to defeat Goliath, Jalut. And at the same time, the number of people who were fighting with Talut alayhi salam, with the king Talut, they were very few. And yet they were able to defeat a larger number of people. And that's why Allah Azza wa Jal, He reminds us, He says, how many times has it happened where a small group of people were able to overcome a large group of people? Because victory comes from Allah Azza wa Jal. But the victory only comes from Allah when we submit. Once again, submit. And when we submit, then the victory of Allah is near. There is also a great lesson in that for the caller to Allah Azza wa Jal. In the same way that Talut alayhi salam had to be patient with his people, and the different prophets had to be patient with their people, we too have to be patient with the people when we're calling to Allah Azza wa Jal. Many may leave you, many may not follow you when you're trying to call them to the truth. But as long as you are patient and you persevere, then Allah Azza wa Jal will allow you to make it through. And that is what Allah Azza wa Jal wants from you. He wants action. In terms of the result, that is with Allah Azza wa Jal. But when He sees the action, He rewards us for that. And that is all that is within our hands. So this, insha'Allah, is the conclusion of the second juz of the Quran. And insha'Allah, tomorrow we will start the third juz and insha'Allah complete Surah Al-Baqarah. And we will also start Surah Al-Imran. We hope and ask Allah Azza wa Jal to allow all that we learnt right now for that to be beneficial knowledge for us, one that we implement in our lives, one that will be a source of happiness for us in the hereafter, a witness for us on the Day of Judgment, not against us. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.